Johnny Carson looked like a man who had it all together: charm, timing, and a smile that could silence a room. For 30 years, he ruled late night television with an effortless cool that no one could touch. But behind the scenes, that calm exterior was hiding something much darker. Carson's friends said he was two different people: the sharp, controlled professional millions adored, and the quiet man who reached for a drink the moment the camera stopped rolling. It wasn't gossip. Even his closest confidants admitted that alcohol followed him like a shadow through every phase of his career. From whispered stories of blackout nights in New York to the public DUI that made national headlines, Johnny's relationship with alcohol became a battle he never fully escaped. He could make America laugh for hours, then spend the night drowning in silence. These are the moments, both public and private, when the king of late night lost his grip. The stories that reveal the side of Johnny Carson the cameras were never meant to catch. Before Johnny Carson became the calm, commanding figure of late night television, he was a man still trying to find his footing in the chaos of New York City. It was the early 1960s, the golden age of live television, and Johnny was suddenly everywhere. He'd stepped into the shoes of Jack Paar as host of The Tonight Show, a position that came with impossible pressure and a kind of fame that could swallow anyone whole. And for Carson, that pressure came with a nightly escape: a drink. In those early years, his charm on camera masked something turbulent offstage. Friends and colleagues from that era would later say that Johnny didn't just drink, he drank to disappear. Behind closed doors, he was known for drinking himself into blackouts, according to one account. A 1978 New Yorker profile would later describe him bluntly as a blackout drunk during those early New York years. It was a label that painted a very different picture of the man America thought they knew. Carson's colleagues noticed the transformation. He could walk into a party with the same sharp wit that made him a star, and walk out hours later a completely different person. The quiet Midwesterner became short-tempered, restless, and distant. In one anecdote recalled by a close acquaintance, Carson once showed up to a late-night writers' meeting visibly intoxicated, only to spend the next morning apologizing to everyone in sight. It was the kind of pattern that repeated itself more often than anyone wanted to admit. But even as whispers spread, Johnny's reputation never cracked publicly. He was too good, too disciplined at keeping the two worlds apart. On camera, he was the master of timing. Off camera, he was the man trying to control the ticking clock inside his own head. He didn't stumble onto the stage, and he never let his private battles bleed into his performance. To the millions watching, he was still the flawless host who never missed a beat. When The Tonight Show moved from New York to Los Angeles in 1972, the change wasn't just about television, it was about survival. Carson reportedly used the move to clean up, distancing himself from the nightlife that had fed his worst habits. The man who once spent his nights surrounded by smoke and whiskey glasses began sipping coffee on camera, a quiet symbol of control that most viewers never noticed. But control is fragile, and for someone like Johnny Carson, it never lasted forever. The move to Los Angeles didn't erase the past, it just buried it under brighter lights. And soon, that same darkness would follow him west, where the world would finally see cracks in the image he'd spent years perfecting. By the early 1980s, Johnny Carson had everything: money, fame, and the unshakable title of the King of Late Night. His show was a cultural institution, his influence unmatched. To the outside world, he seemed untouchable, the man who could joke his way out of anything. But behind that image, old habits had never fully disappeared. And on a quiet October night in 1982, they finally caught up with him. Carson was driving his DeLorean home through Los Angeles when police pulled him over. He'd been weaving through traffic, the car drifting just enough to raise suspicion. The smell of alcohol was obvious. When officers asked him to step out, Johnny complied without argument. The man who had spent his life in control was suddenly reduced to another late-night arrest report, his blood alcohol level above the legal limit. News of the incident spread like wildfire. It wasn't just any celebrity getting caught, it was Johnny Carson. The headlines were merciless: Carson arrested for DUI. The public reaction was shock mixed with disbelief. The man who had made a career out of calm confidence now faced something he couldn't charm his way out of. For once, Johnny's famous grin couldn't save him. He pleaded no contest, was fined, and sentenced to 3 years of probation. For a man as private and proud as Carson, the punishment wasn't just legal, it was emotional. Friends later said the humiliation hit him hard. He didn't rage or deflect, he retreated. Those close to him described the weeks after as unusually quiet. The man who made millions laugh every night barely spoke at all. The arrest didn't destroy his career, but it cracked his armor. For years he'd managed to keep his demons behind closed doors, but now the whole country knew. It was as if the secret he'd spent decades controlling had spilled into the streetlights of Beverly Hills. He was human after all, and that truth was harder for him to face than any courtroom. Still, Carson did what he always did best. He turned the pain into professionalism. He went back to work, sharper and more disciplined than ever. He didn't joke about the incident on air. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. But those who knew him sensed a shift. The man who once drank to forget was now haunted by the memory he couldn't erase. And according to one close friend, the guilt drove him to a confession that few ever heard. Johnny Carson didn't let people get close to him. The walls around his private life were tall and guarded, even among his closest friends. But one man managed to step inside those walls, his lawyer, confidant, and sometimes drinking partner, Henry Bushkin. For more than 15 years, Bushkin handled everything for Johnny: contracts, divorces, investments, even quiet personal crises. And in that time, he saw a side of Carson the public never imagined. In his memoir, Bushkin recalled one night that said it all. They were sitting together in Carson's Los Angeles home long after midnight. The room was silent except for the faint clink of ice in their glasses. Out of nowhere, Johnny looked up and said, "You know, Henry, I get drunk every night." There was no punchline, no smirk, just honesty. A man admitting, maybe for the first time, that the habit had become a cage. That confession wasn't dramatic, it was almost casual. But to Bushkin, it revealed everything. The long hours Johnny spent alone after taping, the drinks that filled the quiet spaces fame couldn't reach, and the endless cycle of control and release that defined his life. On camera, he was poised; off camera, he was restless. He once told Bushkin he drank not to celebrate, but to slow down the noise. Carson's drinking didn't always lead to chaos. That was the problem. It was subtle, private, and perfectly hidden behind charm and success. Friends described him as functional, the kind of man who could have 5 drinks, go home, and still deliver a flawless show the next night. But the cost was invisible. The alcohol didn't make him reckless, it made him distant. It dulled his warmth, strained his marriages, and left him more isolated than anyone realized. Bushkin's memoir painted a portrait of a man divided in two: Johnny Carson, the entertainer America adored, and John Carson, the lonely perfectionist who couldn't turn off the performance. The line between the two blurred as the years went on. Bushkin said that by the late 1970s he could see the fatigue setting in, not physical but emotional. The laughter on stage was starting to sound like an echo. That late-night confession stayed with Bushkin for decades. To him, it wasn't self-pity, it was truth. The kind of truth Carson would never share publicly. Because no matter how many drinks he poured, he still understood the one rule he'd built his empire on: never let them see you break. But the more he tried to hide it, the harder that became. And soon, even his biographers couldn't ignore the two faces of Johnny Carson. By the time Johnny Carson reached the height of his fame, even those who knew him best described two completely different men. Biographers, friends, and colleagues all agreed that there was Johnny, the smiling, effortless performer America worshipped, and then there was John, the private man who retreated into silence the moment the applause faded. It wasn't just about alcohol anymore. It was about the effort of maintaining perfection every single night, and the exhaustion that came with it. Bill Zimi, one of Carson's most respected biographers, described him as the most complicated man in the simplest suit. Zimi's research uncovered decades of hidden tension: the nightly drinks that followed every broadcast, the mood swings that crept in during off hours, and the emotional distance that left even close friends guessing which version of Johnny they'd meet that day. Those details weren't scandal, they were symptoms of a man quietly drowning in his own image. Carson's success demanded discipline, and discipline was his mask. He didn't stumble onto the Tonight Show set, and he never let the world see him unprepared. Producers said he treated every episode like a military operation: every cue, every pause, every reaction rehearsed to the millisecond. But beneath that control was a kind of fear that if he ever slipped, if he ever let the real John Carson show through, the illusion of effortless brilliance would disappear. Ironically, that same perfection made the rumors harder to believe. Fans couldn't reconcile the calm, collected host with the stories of anger, loneliness, and drinking that circulated offstage. When tales emerged about nights he lost his temper or drank too much at private events, audiences dismissed them as exaggeration. To them, Carson was the show, polished, untouchable, forever in control. But control, as his friends knew, was exactly what he was fighting to keep. As Zami put it, Carson wasn't an egomaniac. He was a man terrified of losing the rhythm that defined his life. The applause was his safety net, the laughter his oxygen. When the lights dimmed and the noise stopped, he turned to the one thing that dulled the silence: alcohol. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. That split between the legend and the man became the quiet tragedy of Johnny Carson's life. The same gift that made him unforgettable also isolated him completely. And while the public adored his composure, his closest friends saw what it cost him. Still, as the rumor spread, one question lingered for decades: was Carson ever too drunk to perform on his own show? The truth, as always, was complicated. For decades, fans and television historians have debated a single question: was Johnny Carson ever drunk while hosting The Tonight Show? It's the kind of rumor that refuses to die, whispered about in interviews, debated on forums, even hinted at in a few old press columns. But like many legends that surround larger-than-life figures, proof is elusive. What's real is blurry. What's myth is magnetic. And Johnny, perhaps unintentionally, made sure it stayed that way. The truth is, no verifiable evidence shows him appearing visibly intoxicated during a live broadcast. The man was too meticulous, too disciplined to risk something like that. But there were nights when something felt off. His timing slower, his jokes darker, his laughter a beat too loud. To audiences at home, it might have looked like exhaustion, but to those who worked behind the scenes, it sometimes hinted at something heavier. One former staffer once said, Johnny would never let himself be drunk on camera, but there were nights you could tell he wanted to be. What did fuel the rumors were the moments surrounding him. His sidekick, Ed McMahon, was famously fond of a drink, a fact Carson often teased him for on air. Add to that the parade of openly inebriated guests, from Dean Martin's martini-fueled charm to Oliver Reed's chaotic interviews, and The Tonight Show naturally became associated with that cocktail-soaked era of entertainment. It was a time when drinking wasn't taboo. It was part of the show's personality. Some fans point to specific episodes where Carson appeared unusually loose, laughing harder than usual, losing his train of thought, or letting interviews drift. Others claim his subtle slurring in a few 1970s clips hinted at something stronger than coffee in his mug. But those claims have never been confirmed, and producers who worked with him deny ever seeing Carson impaired on set. They describe him instead as a master of control, someone who could drink at midnight, then deliver perfection at 5 p.m. the next day. That paradox is what kept the rumors alive. Carson's personal reputation for heavy drinking was well known, and it was easy to project that image onto the screen. The myth of Drunk Johnny fit the narrative fans wanted, the idea that even their hero could fall victim to the same flaws that made him human. But the myth says more about how the public viewed him than what actually happened. In the end, the story of Carson's alleged on-air drinking isn't about proof, it's about perception, the gap between what people wanted to believe and what Johnny allowed them to see. Because if there's one thing he mastered more than timing, it was mystery. And while the audience speculated about what was in his glass, Johnny never answered the question. He just raised it, smiled, and kept them guessing. Johnny Carson was famous for his composure, but every now and then, viewers noticed something different, a looseness in his voice, a twinkle in his eye that felt just a bit stronger than usual. To most people, it looked like he was in a great mood. To others, it looked like something else entirely. Over the years, whispers began circulating. Maybe Johnny wasn't always sipping coffee from that mug on his desk. There are clips from The Tonight Show that still fuel that speculation. One in particular shows Carson giggling uncontrollably through an entire segment, unable to finish a question without cracking up. The guest tried to keep it together while Johnny wiped tears from his eyes, clutching his coffee cup like a lifeline. Fans loved it. It was pure, unfiltered Carson. But behind the laughter, some wondered if there was more than caffeine keeping the good times rolling. Former staffers have occasionally hinted that Johnny liked to loosen up before certain episodes, especially toward the end of the week. Nothing wild, they say, just a drink or two in the dressing room to take the edge off. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It was just something nobody talked about. Late-night TV in the 70s and 80s was a different world, where the air smelled of cigarette smoke, the guest toasted between takes, and the line between a social drink and a performance enhancer blurred under the studio lights. There's one particular episode fans point to when debating the rumors, the night Carson had Dean Martin on the show. Martin was famous for drinking on camera, and that night their chemistry was different. Both men laughed harder than usual, stumbling over jokes and riffing off each other with a looseness that felt a little too natural. It's good stuff, isn't it? Martin quipped at one point, nodding toward Johnny's cup. Carson grinned, the kind of grin that said everything and nothing at the same time. Whether he was buzzed or just high on adrenaline, no one ever really knew, and that was the genius of Johnny Carson. He kept you guessing. His timing, even when slightly off, somehow still worked. If there were nights when he showed up a bit too relaxed, he turned it into part of the act. A missed cue became a punchline. A stumble became a setup. If he was ever drunk on air, he turned it into good television without anyone being quite sure. And that mystery became part of his legend. He never admitted it, and no one ever proved it. But fans still swear that on a few of those nights, the laughter just hit a little too easily, the charm came a little too naturally, and Johnny Carson, the man who built an empire on control, finally let the guard drop, just enough for everyone to notice. In the 1970s, late-night television was drenched in the glow of studio lights and the haze of cocktail culture. Drinking wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. On The Tonight Show, guests often walked on stage with a drink in hand. The audience cheered, and everyone laughed like it was part of the act. And in a way it was. Alcohol wasn't a taboo, it was an accessory. Johnny Carson, always aware of the times, played along. But the irony wasn't lost on those who knew him best. The man joking about drinking was also quietly fighting his own battles with it. No one embodied that era more than comedian Foster Brooks, the master of the lovable drunk routine. He'd stumble onto the stage, slurring his words just enough to make the crowd howl. Carson adored the act. He invited Brooks on repeatedly, laughing until tears streamed down his face as Brooks pretended to lose control of his words and body. But sometimes, the laughter had a sharper edge. Watching the bit, you could almost see Johnny's face shift between amusement and something else, recognition. Brooks was parodying what Carson himself spent years trying to hide. Alcohol was everywhere on The Tonight Show. Dean Martin's glass was as much a prop as the microphone. Guests toasted to success on air, and even commercials of the time romanticized the idea that a good drink made life better. Carson thrived in that world, the cool, confident host who could sip and smile without ever crossing the line. But it also blurred the boundaries between the jokes and the truth. When Johnny laughed at the drunk act, some wondered whether he was laughing with Foster Brooks or at himself. Behind the scenes, crew members have said the parties after taping often ran late, with champagne flowing and laughter echoing down the NBC hallways. Carson was usually there, drink in hand, charming everyone in the room, but always keeping his real emotions tucked away. He didn't lose control, not in front of anyone. That was his rule. The danger came later, in the silence of his Malibu home, when the audience was gone and the applause had stopped. Culturally, Carson's Tonight Show marked the end of an era, the last time America's biggest stars could drink openly on camera without backlash. The laughter, the toasts, the cigar smoke, it all looked glamorous then, but looking back now, it's hard not to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. For Johnny, those jokes about drinking weren't just funny, they were camouflage. And as the 1980s rolled in, the tone changed. Television grew cleaner, the humor sharper, the nights quieter. But for Carson, that old association never went away. The public still saw him as cool, smooth, and unshakable. But those who knew him best understood the truth. The lovable drunk had become a character he could no longer play without feeling the weight of what it really meant. Johnny Carson spent his life mastering control. Every pause, every punchline, every smirk was calculated with precision. On camera, nothing slipped through the cracks. Not his timing, not his tone, not even his posture. But off camera, he was fighting a battle no one could rehearse for. The same discipline that made him flawless on stage left him fragile in private. The audience never saw the struggle, but it was always there, waiting for him when the lights went out. He drank to quiet his thoughts, not to chase pleasure, to slow his mind, not to escape it. And even though he laughed about it, even though he teased guests and played the charming host, the truth lingered between the lines. Alcohol wasn't a vice for him, it was a symptom, a way to cope with the endless demand of perfection, the silence of an empty room after everyone had stopped laughing. Those closest to him said Carson's greatest fear was losing control. That's why he never let the public see him drunk. He could tease the idea, hint at it, even dance around the subject on air, but he would never hand over that power. The king of late night would rather fall apart in private than break his illusion in front of the crowd that adored him. By the end of his career, he'd learned to replace whiskey with water, jokes with reflection. The world never saw a breakdown, never saw him stumble. But the price of that composure was isolation. Behind every perfect monologue was a man fighting to stay composed, not for fame, but for survival. And maybe that's the real story of Johnny Carson. Not the drinking, not the rumors, but the impossible balance he tried to keep between performance and peace, laughter and loneliness, control and collapse. He didn't always win that battle, but he never stopped trying. So when people look back on those old Tonight Show clips and wonder what was in Johnny's cup, the answer doesn't really matter. What mattered was how he held it. Steady, confident, smiling, a symbol of a man who made imperfection look effortless, even when the world didn't know how much it cost him.